All right, everybody, welcome to the Huddle Up podcast once again. I'm Michi. Ricky is being our engineer today. Thank you for tuning back in. We have a very special guest here with us today. We're actually on location. We want to thank Pastor Bishop Eric E. Vassol and Pastor Elverta Vassol for allowing us to be on location at Living Word of Christ Fellowship Ministries in Grandview, Missouri. We have with us Dr. Elverta E. Vassol, who agreed to talk with us today on a very special, important subject on mental health. Dr. Elverta Vassol has 7 adult children, 17 grandchildren. She's married to Bishop-elect Eric E. Vassol, and they have both walked the same path for the past 34 years. Dr. Vassol attended Kansas State University, go Wildcats.
Yay.
She completed her Ph.D. in the Department of Family Services of the College of Human Ecology. The title of her dissertation was African American Pastors' Perceptions of Health Needs. So that is going to be very instrumental in our talk today. She currently serves with her husband, Bishop-elect Eric E. Vassol, as the executive pastor of Living Word of Christ Fellowship Ministries in Grandview, Missouri. Thank you for being with us. How are you doing today?
I am good, Michi. How are you today?
I'm good. We're glad to be here. We're excited. Once again, we thank you for talking with us. I mean, someone of your position, we know you're very busy. We know you and your husband are very busy, so we thank you for taking this time out to talk with us today on the subject of mental illness. So if you like, we can get straight into it and try to inform the people. Is that cool?
Yeah, that'll work. Well, thank you all for having me. This is a special pleasure for me because it's my passion. Dealing with mental health in African American and other cultures has been an experience I've had for approximately 20 years now.
Exactly.
I've worked at Fort Riley. Did some stuff on Fort Riley with alcohol and substance abuse. Also did a lot of in-home therapy. So I saw families and groups and situations. And currently, it's just seemed to have just magnified, especially when it comes to mental illness. Has never been a secret. But the way it was dealt with in the past was people would be shut away or put into institutions.
Exactly.
And so once the policies began to change at the federal level, it became the community's problem or the community's responsibility to serve the problem.
So it's safe to say that your passion has been wanting to see the family healed from the mental standpoint.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I get that.
Holistically, we talk about in our ministry the soul, the spirit, and the body.
Yeah.
But when people are not dealing with the emotions and the feelings that they've had, that they don't know how to manage when it may not always be something of a outer world nature.
Exactly.
It may be chemistry. It may be something physiological.
So with that, to the people that are tuning in, tell us exactly what mental health or mental illness is.
Okay. Well, mental illness, when it's been documented or the symptoms or behaviors, they're looking at brain disorders. And that can be schizophrenia. You hear a lot about bipolar disorder. People use that very lightly, but there's different axes for that. We talked about the diagnostic DSM-5 that is out. Professionally, that is used to do the diagnosis. And then there's major depression. And many times we can't admit to being depressed because they think that you don't have faith, or they feel like because you're having a bad day, you're not trusting the Lord.
Exactly.
But these are documented brain disorders that can be there, and it does take a professional a lot of times to really make those diagnoses, and we just can't assume that because someone's acting a certain way that behavior is not real.
Exactly. So is it a case where there are certain cultures, ergo African American, Hispanic that are more reluctant to address their need for the help for their mental illness?
I think that from what I've learned and studied, that over time, what has happened with people of color, whether you're African American, our brown brothers and sisters, Latino, Puerto Rican, whatever your background is, it just depends on what the system was in the home.
I see.
And for African Americans, our culture has been where we keep things in the home. We keep things pretty tight. We don't tell other people our business. And so when it has been to where someone has had some real issues when it comes to mental illness or mental health, or looking like behaviors were a problem, they usually would show up when they got to school, and then the teacher's calling, and it becomes a discipline problem. And so the reason why I think we have had those issues is because we don't want to look like we're not weak, that we're not strong people.
Exactly.
And we can be perceived by the dominant population as people that always have something going on that is not always, you can put your finger on it.
Exactly.
And we've always want to make sure we can control our families.
So as a side question, before we move on, is it safe to say that some of the ways that we have been taught, can they also be a trigger, or can that also be some of the reason that we have mental illness?
It can be. It definitely can add to it. It can be internalized because all our forefathers may have known was a certain way to address whatever's going on, and it may look like one thing, and no one ever told, Big Mama or uncle or whomever that this young person or even you may really have some challenges that may need to be seen about, because we have not had the resources, financial resources. We not have always had insurance available to us, and sometimes you were turned away at the hospital because it wasn't open to people of color.
Yeah.
And then so there's a lot of reasons. If families were working from day to day, 60, 70-hour weeks, you just didn't have time. You came home, made sure your family was safe, you fed them, and went to the next thing in life. So
I see. So another question to add on to that. Does poverty play a part? Either having enough or having too little, does that also play a part in mental illness, or the getting the help for mental illness?
I think that that's a strong indicator of being able to get the help you need, is to have the right insurance in place.
I see.
The poverty levels that is usually disproportionate to people of color, because there's maybe a smaller number. 13% of the population in the United States is African American. So you have a smaller percentage of people, but you have a higher percentage that don't have. So their disadvantages are so strong, and that's when you go into trying to get insurance for the family. Let's say you have a halfway decent job, and you're trying to get that insurance for the family is much more than if it's just for an individual. And then if you're in a low wage or not have a living wage, where you do not have insurance offered through those particular economic systems, then you don't have access. Even when we have Slow Parkway, I'll use the names of Slow Parkway Mental Health Center, Comprehensive Health Center, been in the community for years. It was one of the stopgaps for what was going on in our community way back in the 80s. I'm just going back to some history. I'm dating myself, but it was important that you had people that did not have the economics to have somewhere where they had a sliding scale. But still, there was not enough funds always available to support the level of need.
Exactly. And
so, most likely, in your predominant population, you have a higher need than you do in the smaller percentages because there's more people. So, it's a catch-22. So, poverty has its implications, lack of knowledge. The appearance of making sure you look well. Yeah. And if you talk to someone longer than 20 minutes, you find out they're not as well as they really are. Because no one has ever been able to identify correctly.
And I think that's the major thing is we don't we don't know what a mental illness is. And I think a lot of times, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of times people put the wrong connotation on mental illness.
That's right.
So when we hear it in its wrong sense, it's like, oh, well, no, I don't have that.
That's right.
That's not me. You know?
That's right. And on that point, though, even when you go to a physician, it's usually the primary care physician.
Yeah.
And you're going to say, well, my toe hurts. And so then they're going to just deal with your toe.
Yeah.
But you don't know to tell them the reason why my toe hurts is because I'm not getting enough sleep at night. And so my body's not getting restorative. So therefore, that can lead to depression.
Wow,
that can lead to anxiety. That can lead to stressors that are over the top, that can put your body into a whole nother place where your cortisol is being depleted because there's nothing to offset what's going on. So people say, if you can't sleep at night, read your Bible. Well, that has its place.
Yeah.
But it may not just always be that you need something to calm you. It may be something within the chemistry of your body that, again, your forefathers didn't tell you that they couldn't sleep at night either.
Exactly. So with speaking of our forefathers and our ancestors and things like that, can you tell us what have been some of the more memorable moments in history that have produced generations that developed mental illness as a result of those major memorable moments?
Okay. I'm gonna go back about 50 or 60 years ago, just in the most recent history. There was a report that came out called the Monahan Report, and I believe it was about 1964, 1966, and it suggested that the African American family was deprived because there was no male in the home.
Wow.
And this was documented.
Wow.
You can, when I say Monahan, you can find it real easily. You can read the report. And he was saying that the black family does not have a male in the home, so therefore they're disenfranchised, they're disoriented, they have nothing to center them. And so with those documents, then you have your professionals that read them, and then that will affect the lack thereof of care, because the assumption is that the family itself is dysfunctional. Because they seem not to see a male in the home because they're either in prison or they're dead or went off to the war.
Wow.
Because all the Korean War, Vietnam War, our people have always been involved in protecting our country. So therefore that would take the father out the home.
Wow.
So when mental illness did come up in the family because there's a missing element to the home, any family may be affected, but everyone handles it differently. And if the parent doesn't know what they're looking at, then it will just go untreated.
Exactly.
Can I ask
So
you a question?
yeah, no. That was great, because I actually want to piggyback on that and ask you about things like the riot from '92,
Yes.
Rodney King.
Yes. I read that
Because
book.
people were upset with
Yes.
the verdict, but the riots spread like wildfire, and it touched, a lot of people. We have the crack epidemic of the '80s in Detroit.
That's good.
We have, of course, we all know what happened in 1619 when slavery started. How do those instances or those moments still affect us today? How do they affect us in how we live, how we think in terms of what we do now?
Well, all of what you just spoke of has just continued to build a mountain of stress and lack of control. Even though the socioeconomics may have changed over the years, when we originally came here, when you mentioned the 1600s, how we were taken from a place for the consumerism of a group of people. Okay,
Exactly.
so then we and then I'll go to 1992, because I did read Rodney King's book, and one of the key issues with Rodney King in his book before he passed, he talked about he was beat in the home so severely, so when the police were beating him, he didn't even feel it like other people felt it. Because he would sit down by the river. He grew up in L.A.
Yeah.
And his dad would take him fishing, but there was some tremendous beatings he took, and you can refer to the book if I'm vague on some of the details, but I did read that, and I was like, man, for him to take, because we saw on TV what happened to him.
Exactly.
And he didn't feel it like that, like we saw it. So he had became a resistant, and then after he was, the verdict, and he was used by the system, by his attorneys. And so think of the mindset of someone, his parents were probably born in the late 40s or whatever, late 30s. So they came through a time of segregation where there was no law to protect you, even if you lived in what would be called a free state.
Goodness, yeah.
And so all of these public events that have occurred, the crack epidemic, I think they're more than just conspiracy theories. We know that certain things were filtered into certain groups of people.
Exactly.
For the whole point of to hold down a whole group of people, oppressing them. Well, when you deal with mental illness, when you look at it from a documented sense, then you never get to the hospital, you get to the prison.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you've reacted to what has happened to whatever maybe been in your home or in school. Males are targeted anyway in the school system.
Yeah.
Any moves you might make may look like you're being aggressive. And so those are just lack of knowledge on our educators' point, on our politicians' point. So there's a lot of material here.
There definitely is. I'm pretty sure we could talk all night about it, which would be very informative. I want you to address your dissertation real quick. Touch on some points in that. The African American pastors' perceptions of mental health
in their congregants. That was the key. I wanted to know how they looked at mental health amongst the parishioners, the people that came to their church.
Yeah.
I sent out over 100 assessments, and it was approximately 7 pages. And so I sent them across the country. And I sent out more than 100 or some. I only got about 70 some back. There's always a rate of non-return.
Exactly.
I stamped them. I made sure that they had a self-stamp. So I wanted to make sure it was easy for a pastor to send it back, because we know they're busy. And what I received back was pastors approximately in the age range of 25 to 50. And it seemed like the idea was that if they had a parishioner or a congregant or a member that had mental health issues, that they could recognize it and that they would refer them.
Yeah.
That wasn't the experience that I actually practically saw. That's why I sent them out. But the numbers did not necessarily support my hypothesis in the way that I thought they were, because I had like 4 or 5 nice hypotheses. I said, well, if they see this person in their congregation, they're going to think it's a demon. I actually stated that. So they're going to think it's a spiritual implication. They need to lay hands on them. They need to read the scriptures, because I know that's what we practice.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, we believe that. No, it works. But knowing that there may need to be a holistic approach to it, we may need to do that, and then we need some follow-up.
Yeah.
And so what I found is that pastors in their responses sometimes was even sarcastic.
Really?
And I really found that disappointing, because I'm like, this is a very serious issue.
Exactly.
And I recognized it many years ago. And so I wanted to make sure that I provided some documentation that was had a hypothesis, that had relevant and valid statistical measures in place to say, okay, this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
And the numbers that came back, the way it turned out, I did not necessarily get the results that I expected.
Yeah.
But I thank God that the pastors and them, that being a pastor, that they brought it forth. They sent those that sent them back, and that we did learn from that and how we need to add to the literature.
Yeah, I see. That's. I mean, and I think a lot of people, especially our church goers, it's very much needed, especially in the church. Like you said, a lot of times, sometimes we want to write people off as having a demon. Well, sometimes I'm just broke, or sometimes, this happened or that happened. Is there something else going on with me other than a demonic possession? So, and I think that's very informative, and it would have been nice for you to get the response
that you really sought after?
Well,
But-
that I expected.
Exactly.
And maybe I was making assumptions, and every time a researcher goes forth, they have some bias themselves. And so I had to make sure that the researcher's bias didn't get involved in what I was asking.
Exactly.
And so I had to be professional enough to say, oh, okay. So I reported what I received, documented it correctly, so someone else could build on that same literature, and hopefully in the next few years, you're going to see a little bit different outcomes. If those same pastors were to be, and some really mainstream pastors were involved, and I think that in some of those it was anonymous. I knew they were. I had to actually have addresses, so I had to send them to people I knew, but they had to know what they were sending back was confidential.
Exactly.
And so they're definitely they're safe. They're safe.
Well, we definitely we thank you. This has been informative. I know for myself. Hopefully for the people that are viewing. Another question I would like to ask before we wrap things up: how do you be a support to someone who may have a mental illness?
That's a good question. First, let's not make assumptions about people. Second, we use a lot of humor to offset
Yeah.
the seriousness of things that are going on, because we don't want to feel like we're making people uncomfortable.
I see.
But if you have a resource in your community, you may have someone in your ministry that's a resource for that. Or if I always want to refer someone to the correct place where they can feel safe.
I see.
They must be safe. Our local community health centers have those options in place, but when you're talking about in your local church, the people that are with boots on the ground,
Yeah.
that are really practicing what they're preaching,
Exactly.
you got to have somebody in-house that can first do an assessment, evaluate that either this is in my purview of strengths or I need to refer you out.
I see.
And so I hope those are some ideas.
Yeah.
And then obviously we are definitely doing better at making sure that mental health is acknowledged by saying it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we are offering some support, community outreach in the next couple of weeks. So
Awesome.
possibly if you want me to share that information.
Oh yeah, please do. Please expound on
Yeah,
it.
okay, okay. In October the 18th is Thursday afternoon, 83rd and Holmes. I was asked to present the screams that no one hears.
Okay.
And it's at Bishop Chavis Church. Only reason
I
why
was just
I'm
gonna.
missing,
Okay. Yeah.
missing that 8310
8310 Holmes, yeah.
yes. Their women group wanted me to come and talk about domestic violence and suicide.
Yeah. Very
It's needed for the community. And then that following weekend, which is October 20th, here at Living Word of Christ Fellowship Ministry, we will do a domestic violence and suicide prevention workshop, which we will have the coordinator from Fort Riley that deals with domestic violence with the military. And then I'm going to talk more about suicide, especially amongst our youth.
No problem.
Yeah, so we really
Okay.
want to
Definitely.
cover the spectrum of the family. And it's
Yeah.
for whosoever.
Yeah.
There's no registration to come here. It's for male, female. It's not designated to any group. Anybody can come in. This begins at 10 a.m. That's Saturday morning.
Saturday morning.
That's October 20th here at Living Word, 12419 3rd Street, Grandview, Missouri.
Definitely. Yeah, we're definitely going to make sure we put blast that information out, because
Great.
with this being September, it is also Suicide Awareness Month.
Yes.
So we want people to be aware of that. It's very real. Like you said, we can't just write people off as being crazy or having a demonic possession. People are hurting.
Yes.
Sometimes people are hurting over the simplest thing, but it grew,
That's right.
into a major problem. So, but once again, we thank you so much for accepting our invitation to address a very major need, a very major topic that needs to be talked about more.
Yes.
We hope for more opportunities for
Great.
you to give us your expertise.
Oh,
We
okay.
want to thank Bishop-elect
Yes.
Eric Vassol for allowing us to be on site at
My
Living Word of
husband.
Christ Fellowship Ministries. That's right, her husband.
My husband. Yes.
We thank you for tuning in to the Huddle Up podcast. We will be providing information for people to get help, for people to get resources if they need it. We don't want anyone to be left out. We
No.
don't want anyone to be written off. Are there any parting words or any last words that you would like to leave?
Yes, I want to encourage parents, whether you a single parent or both parents are in the home. I want to encourage you to be involved with your children, and even if it's just you and your spouse, be able to have a conversation safe enough in the home. The domestic violence piece is something we didn't even touch on. But a lot of times communication has been affected, economics have affected homes, and so people are very frustrated and angry because they're afraid of what may be getting ready to happen
Exactly.
just around the world. So we know that prayer changes everything, so I want to make sure that you know that we are here, even with Michi being available to provide this resource for you. Be encouraged, families, because we are strong, and we are only strong as we are strong together versus trying to do it all by yourself. And we're here for you. So
Exactly.
God bless you.
So with that, we thank you for tuning in. I'm Michi. We're going to see you next time.